Hey everyone, this is Serge Dedina, the mayor of Imperial Beach, California, which is the last town on the California coast. So if you've seen the image of the giant border wall that's in the ocean, my town is just north of that. It's actually a really nice town surrounded by open water. But I want to thank all our South by Southwest attendees, I'm assuming are virtually around the world, and of course in Austin and around the country, for participating and attending this panel about rising coastlines. And we have a distinguished international panel of scientists and policymakers, including myself. So I'll turn it over to my fellow panelists, but we're really grateful for all of you to be here and listen really and participate in this very important discussion.
I'm A.R. Siders. I'm one of the academic researchers on the panel. I'm at the University of Delaware with the Disaster Research Center, and I'm in geography in the Biden School of Public Policy. And I study coastal climate change adaptation and particularly managed retreat away from the rising seas.
I'm Mark Merrifield. I'm at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, a physical oceanographer. My specialty is studying sea level rises and the impacts of the rising sea levels on coastal communities. And I'm also the director of the Center for Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation.
My name is Anote Tong. I was president of the Republic of Kiribati between 2003 and until 2016. Throughout my period of presidency together, and since taking retirement in 2016, I had been involved with advocacy on climate change, particularly trying to bring out the human dimension of climate change. My work has been primarily to advocate for the most vulnerable countries to what is happening on climate change, especially with sea level rise. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'll kick things off by giving just a little bit of a background of what we're up against. So how fast is sea level rising now? What are the projections for the future? And what are some of the considerations that these panelists are particularly well suited to address? First slide here that I wanted to share with you is from a report by the IPCC, what's called the Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere and a Changing Climate. And it gives a projection of sea level relative to the observed record. And it's very similar to many similar projections and gives a nice sort of summary of where we're headed. So let me start first with this purple line down here, which is the observed sea level, which is goes back to 1900 here. It's a remarkable combination of two separate observing systems, the tide gauge network around the world and the satellite altimetry, which is measuring sea level from space since about 1993. And since 1993, we've really been able to, with that system, to be able to do a truly global average of sea level and really understand all the processes that affect sea level. So extending beyond that are these red and blue lines. And so the blue line is a projection of sea level, where will it be by 2100? Assuming that we're in a emission scenario, which for this report was called RCP 2.6, but it's an aggressive scenario where we're actively trying to lower greenhouse gas emissions. RCP 8.5 is more of a business as usual, not really changing from our current trajectory. So you can see quite the difference here. By the end of the century, the more aggressive track will put us at about 43 centimeters above our present day. And if we elect to do very little, we'll be at 84, maybe as high as 110 centimeters by the end of the century. So we are looking then at a situation where global sea level is going up at about 20, has gone up by about 20 centimeters since 1900. We know because of some other systems that I'll tell you about in a moment that land ice melt and ocean warming account for this rise, both tied to global warming. And our projections then put us at about 40 to 110 centimeters by 2100, depending on the emission scenario. So this is one of the remarkable achievements of the geosciences since about 25 years ago. It's the ability to do global budgets of sea level, not just of how sea level is changing, but the components that make up sea level. So sea level is rising because the mass of the ocean is changing as ice melts, more water goes into the ocean. And it's warming, which causes the water to expand, and sea level is rising because the ocean is absorbing most of the heat that is entering their system through greenhouse gas warming. So let's dig into this projection to 2100. What is going to mean for different communities around the world? So on the right-hand side here is a plot which shows that the risk to coastal geographies by the end of the century. For each panel here, there's a right and a left bar. The left bar would be no specific or no aggressive adaptation changes made. So basically another business as usual situation where we just let things run as they are. The next one with the check above it would be as if there is a maximum adaptation strategy applied. And you can see at different levels of where the sea level is going to be, just how serious the threat will be, going from undetectable change to a very harmful change. So along sort of resource-rich coastal cities, which are able to spend resources to adapt, even in the worst case scenario, it would be sort of a moderate to high risk by the end of the century. On the next one over, we can see that adaptation strategies would have a pretty profound effect, keeping things at a pretty manageable level. An urban atoll island is a considerably different story. Without any adaptation strategy, by the end of the century and under the worst scenario, we'd be in a very high risk situation with profound consequences. And even with adaptation strategy, the future is quite dire. And so on for large agricultural deltas and Arctic communities. We can see that there is choices to be made here, not only in how the emission scenario plays forward into the century and where we'll be in terms of our sea level curves, but also in our efforts to adapt to these changes. So what are the main issues facing coastal communities? The first one is, as the sea level rises, at some point, it's just going to permanently flood, or the land will be permanently submerged. We'll see enhanced flooding during king tides and high storm events. They'll be more and more frequent as sea level goes up, causing almost every high tide to become an issue. Coastal erosion of beaches and coastal land will increase as the water rises. There's going to be changes to coastal ecosystems that we are already seeing. As the saltwater rises, salinization of soils, groundwater, and surface water will become an issue. This will be a particularly big issue for island regions. And the land will just become a lot less able to drain because the groundwater level is so high. This one is a scary plot because that was out to 2100 where we saw, well, there's a difference between the scenarios, but they're sort of in the same ballpark. This shows what happens if it just remains unchecked going forward. Again, the blue line here going forward is sea level rising out to 2300. This is under a very, very aggressive emissions reduction scenario, and then the red line business as usual. So you can see that it's not only an issue of getting out to 2100, but as we go farther than that, we're talking about a world that is completely changed, where we're seeing a coastal zone flooded with 3 meters of sea level rise will profoundly change the landscape of our coastal environments, compared to a situation where with effective emissions controls, we can keep things at a manageable level, even out several centuries in the future. Just a word of what we're doing at Scripps. So these are all global predictions, and the issue is, how do you downscale this to your backyard? What's happening, and how can I use this information for planning and projection purposes? So here's a study we did at Imperial Beach where we're looking to understand the causes of flooding for what today's flood risk is, and then to use that information to improve projections going into the future. So that requires a fairly intensive, at least for us, a fairly intensive observational component where we're using remote sensing, in situ sensors in the water, sensors across the beach, all trying to understand how waves propagate across the shoreline, how the beach is changing, and how that water gets overtops coastal barriers and into the city. That is leading to products that we're working with the city to try and develop on giving some advanced warning of flooding. And it's also the same models that will be used to give higher resolution looks at the future projections. So that's where we are. We're facing a future which has large uncertainties, but also has we have some major decisions to make to plot our future. And I wanted to then turn it over to our other panelists here to give an idea of what these threats mean to them on the ground.
Well, thanks, Mark, for that great overview. And, so let's set the stage. Imperial Beach, California, probably the only blue collar, working class, majority minority, mostly Latino beach town left in Southern California, being buffeted by sewage pollution from Mexico and enduring an economic crisis that we've been enduring for a long time because we're a blue collar beach town. And so I say that because, we're an unusual city, and because of our unusual status as a town that has financial needs and our residents, the issue of coastal sea level rise and coastal flooding has serious repercussions for our city and our capacity to serve the needs of our residents, right? Because we're dealing with sea level rise, something that we didn't cause, but we have to pay the price for. And so, we're 4 square miles on the US-Mexico border. The south end of our town is a national wildlife refuge, one of the last and largest remaining saltwater marshes left in California, the Tijuana estuary. We have the Pacific Ocean to the west, beautiful surf, big surf, a good surf beach. To the north, we have South San Diego Bay, which is also a national wildlife refuge. So we're surrounded by water on 3 sides. And as someone who's grew up in Imperial Beach, I've seen the changes over time. So let's set the stage. It's January 19th, 2019. I'm standing on the end of our town at the beach, watching a storm offshore produce 8 to 10 foot surf with elevated tides. It's king tides. I'm there because Mark Merrifield and his team of scientists from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography predicted, using the model that Mark talked about, that we would have that flooding, which allowed us to alert our residents, have our firefighters and lifeguards on hand, our sheriffs to close off certain street ends. And I got hammered. I was busy talking to a reporter, got hammered by a wall of water that washed across the beach. Luckily, I was a lifeguard and a surfer, so I wasn't worried about drowning. But the end result of that was that wall of water pushed sand from our beach into the estuary, covering an area that is federally protected. But the federal government was closed, was shut down. There was a government shutdown. So it cost Imperial Beach tens of thousands of dollars to clean up that mess for the federal government because they wouldn't do it and they couldn't do it. And what I thought at the time was, right, sea level rise, coastal flooding, the federal government couldn't do their job. And so now my blue collar city had to do it. And that's less money that I have for my kids in the junior lifeguard program or swimming lessons for my kids, 30% of who live in poverty. And so to me, that was the essence of what we're dealing with. This climate crisis impacts people who have the least, the most. The people that can't afford to deal with this are the ones who suffer the most. They don't have air conditioning. They can't move their homes. They can't find another job when they lose their job. And then my city can't fill in that money that we don't have with an offshore bank account or lots of our hotel revenues, because we only have one hotel. And so that's the very real issue. So the question becomes, how do we address this? And I'll get to that quickly. First, we started looking at, in 2014, we did a sea level rise impact analysis in partnership with the state of California, and partnered some really great scientists, and our entire community got involved, had meetings with hundreds of people attending. Back then, people didn't say they didn't believe in climate change, at least publicly. And what we found was that 30 to 40% of our town in the next 100 years will be impacted and underwater, basically, will be impacted by coastal flooding. That's 40% of our roads. That's 30 to 40% of our sewage infrastructure, our water infrastructure. And so if you're a small town mayor worried about money, what you say is, wow, it's going to cost us a lot of money. And then we had an economic impact study, and what we showed was could be up to $150 million just to deal with what's going to happen on the public beach, not private property, public infrastructure. So then what do you start to do? Well, we started making plans immediately to retreat our public infrastructure, to start looking at moving our sewer and water lines away from the beach, right? Costs a lot less money to do that now than in the future. So we were engaged in doing that, and changing some of our planning with the state of California. So that's the first thing. Second thing what happened was we said, well, it's going to cost us over $150 million to address damage that we didn't cause. But we know that the world's largest fossil fuel companies have played a major role in causing climate change and sea level rise. So we joined a group of cities and counties in California: San Mateo County, Marin County, Santa Cruz, Imperial Beach, and others. And now that includes Baltimore, the state of Rhode Island, I think the city of San Francisco, New York, and to hold fossil fuel companies accountable under the law in a court of law for causing climate change. And the argument, and people have asked, what do we want? We want them to pay for it, because I can't afford to pay for the damage that those companies have caused and the issue of sea level rise, because right now my kids are paying for it. Our residents are paying for it. They're paying, it's a tax on them. We're taxing the poorest people to basically cause, to pay for the damage that the world's largest fossil fuel companies have caused. So that was the second thing. The third thing is, if you're a small town mayor, and I'm a geographer, just the background, a geographer with a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. So I remember South by Southwest when it was a small event. You want to partner with the world's best scientists and oceanographers to figure out what's happening in your town. So the technological sort of science piece in terms of predictive modeling for cities like ours is critically important. I think Mark, in his usual manner, understated the importance of this. But basically, we need to have tools like this around for every city and every population center around the world, so that Mark and his colleagues and other scientists can help them, alert them to when these storms are coming and what kind of storm surge they can affect. That could save tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives. And then finally, my town is surrounded by coastal wetlands. And what we've realized is that coastal wetlands are now huge carbon sinks, sequester all kinds of what we call blue carbon. And so when we think about infrastructure bills, we need to do everything we can and possible, and that's what we're doing in Imperial Beach, to restore and enhance those wetlands so they can help absorb the emissions, carbon, but also help to deal with the rising seas. So I'll end there, but this is a serious issue that's affecting cities across the country and obviously countries around the world. And if we don't get on this now, we're going to be paying a lot more for it later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Let me begin with a word of thanks to the Scripps Institute for this invitation. And of course, I want to acknowledge my fellow panelists. I want to thank you, Mark. I want to thank you, Serge, for your introductory comments, which I think relate very much to my story, which I'm about to share with you. As I explained, my involvement with climate change, it's getting on to almost two decades by now. And my focus, while in office, had been to highlight the human dimension, because there was a great deal of interest at the scientific level. The reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change were telling some very interesting stories, but of course there was this ongoing controversy over the science. I believe that may have been a result of the lobbying by the energy industry. But by 2008, it was clear that controversy had been resolved, that climate change is real, and that we need to take it seriously. So my involvement on this topic was when I first saw the report by the IPCC, because even the projections at the time, even though there was still controversy, would have been very disastrous for us. And we needed to take it on board. We needed to act on it. The science was very, up to now, in the experience that I've had in reading the reports and seeing what's happening on the ground, and what's our own experience, together with what I hear and see around different parts of the world, simply confirms what the science has been saying. I was in Australia in 2018, and of course, Australia, the Australian government is one of the ones that do not entirely believe in climate change. But of course, in 2019, they had that unprecedented fire. You've had yours in California, and which simply confirms what the science had been predicting. At our own experience at the ground is that for those of you who may not familiar with atoll islands, they're very low-lying atoll land structures. Very narrow strips, barely, on average, about 2 meters above sea level. So you're worried about your coastal areas. Our entire country is a coastal area. And so we are very, very vulnerable. And we've always referred ourselves as being on the front line of the climate change challenge. And quite often I'm asked, so have you seen the rise in sea level? And of course, my answer is, come on, I don't sit there watching the sea rising, But what I do are the impacts of what we are witnessing, okay? And so what it is that we are witnessing, okay? We have communities, villages who had to relocate because the village community is no longer viable. They've had to relocate somewhere else on the island. With the frequent king tides, we get flooding, and of course the list that you put, Mark, are very. I was watching them, and they're exactly the kind of experience we experienced firsthand. You know, the flooding, the contamination of the waterlands from which we draw our potable water. Okay, that's our drinking water. That's how we survive on the underground water. And because we don't have rivers, of course, we don't have any other source of water. And of course, the destruction of food crops, these have been happening and continue to happen. Destruction of homes, and sometimes very severe flooding. We've had some very serious cases of severe flooding with the storms that come from the south. You know, because we're not supposed to get the storms, so we're on the equator. So theoretically, we're not subject to storms, but we are beginning to experience storms. And in 2015, we had a storm that hit the southern Pacific Island countries in Vanuatu, actually went back north and flooded all of the islands of Tuvalu, flooded our southernmost islands severely, but the rest of the islands also more than they'd ever been flooded before, resulting in the destruction of food crops, food trees, which had been there for decades. So this would have been one event over a few decades. So these are the things that we are experiencing, and it's a daily occurrence. It's getting more frequent. But in response to the question, you know, have you seen the sea level rise? And I said, no, but what I have seen in my home, because I live on the ocean side, and in about 30 years that I've been there, maybe, over 20 years, 30 years, I've seen the waves come over a piece of coral head. And so previously, it was just small waves. Now they're huge waves. And so this is happening. There's a lot of building of seawalls to protect the infrastructure, your homes. My home is protected by seawall, which I've had to build, because if I do not do that, my home would be washed away. And so these are the experiences that we are going through, and matching that experience together with the science and the predictions, we really have serious cause for concern. And on the basis of what the IPCC had been projecting, which have been regarded as being somewhat conservative by other reports that I've since read, the sea level will continue to rise to the extent that if our home islands do not go underwater, would become uninhabitable well within this century. I would give us another 20 years, I think, to the time that the islands, most of the islands would be uninhabitable. But what needs to be understood is we are going through this process all the time, gradually, but very progressively. And this is the experience. The question, can you build your adaptation? Well, we haven't been able to come forward with anything credible. This is something that I've always been asking these international conferences that I attend, you know, is there a solution, an international solution? Because this is a global phenomenon. This is a global problem, not caused by our actions, but caused by actions elsewhere. And we need the partnership in dealing with this. But the sad reality is I've always been coming back from these conferences without a solution in my hand that I can offer to my people at the time, that I was in office to say, don't you worry. When the tides do come, this is the solution. And I'm afraid that until today, those solutions remain unavailable. And so what are we facing in the future? I've tried to come to the brutal realization that maybe we may have to relocate and offshore, because we won't be able to relocate within the country. And that would mean going somewhere else, relocating to another country. And that's met a lot of resistance by the people. But I think we have to be brutally realistic to understand what the options are for us into the future. It's not been a very easy realization to come to terms with. But I think we've got to be a little bit dispassionate in dealing with this, because it requires a very cool-headed approach to a very difficult emotional problem. And so that has been what I've been involved in over the years that I've been working. I continue to work on this, continue to look for solutions. Of course, I was very disappointed with the fact that climate change tends to be a political issue. That is one of the greatest tragedies. With a change of government, there is a change of policy on climate change. I've seen this in Australia. I've seen this in New Zealand. And of course, the United States is an example. I recall when I was pushing for action by the European countries, and they said, no, we cannot do much until the United States is on board. And of course, with not the last administration, but the one before that, the United States came on board, and that was, for me, I thought that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. And of course, there's been a change. I'm very happy, and I must say this, that the new administration is taking a totally different approach. But I think we need to work very hard in order to catch up on lost time. Quite frankly, I think I would be honest to say that the prospects for us surviving this as a nation without very radical adaptation measures are very bleak. And I believe there may come a time when our people, most if not all, might have to relocate somewhere else. And of course, that is a totally different political question, which the international community has not been able to address until now. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Well, I'll pick up there because I study climate change adaptation, and I primarily study managed retreat, relocation of communities and people away from sea level rise and away from other hazards. And I started studying it in the United States context after Superstorm Sandy when I was in New York, primarily because the conversation was all about how do we rebuild and not about should we rebuild or where should we rebuild. And I kept hearing from people that this isn't something we do in the United States, and that's wrong. And as a lawyer, I then made it my career for the subsequent several years to document all the reasons that that's wrong. And two big ones, at least. One is that, as just illustrated in this panel, retreat isn't something that happens somewhere else. It's a threat to United States communities as well as to Pacific Island nations. And it's a threat at many scales, to individual homeowners, to infrastructure like water mains or roads, and it's a threat to whole communities and cultures, right? I mean, to sovereignty of states that we haven't addressed. And so it's a major issue. And when I say retreat, I'd like to differentiate between two types of retreat: unmanaged and managed, right? Unmanaged is what we see mostly when we talk about when we see retreat happening. We see people who major disasters destroy their home and they leave. They're sick of being flooded for the 10th time in 10 years, or their crops are inundated, or the soil is poisoned by too much saltwater intrusion and they can no longer stay, and so they leave. We see people just abandoning their properties and moving away. And then we also see managed retreat. We see government relocation programs that can be, on the terrible end, very forceful, right? Slum clearance or displacing entire communities, or we can see ones that are very helpful and trying to help homeowners sell their homes to the government. They turn their land into open space and move out. We see a whole range of options here. And what I want to suggest is that one of the reasons we need to start thinking seriously about managed retreat is because we want to prevent unmanaged retreat. We want to give people support and we want to give people options. And we don't want the best option in their life to be abandoning their home and moving away with no help or no support. We want there to be a support system to help them when that becomes the reality that they have to face. And for a lot of places, they are going to have to face this. This is something we see all over the world. There are examples of managed retreat happening in the United States, in Canada, in Brazil, the Philippines, Indonesia, New Zealand, Nigeria, Austria. This is happening all over, sometimes because of climate change, sometimes because of natural hazards that are being exacerbated by climate change. We're going to see it more and more, and we need to learn from these experiences so we can do it better. The second reason that retreat isn't a somewhere else problem is that it doesn't have to be a problem. We frame it as a last resort option. We frame it as a problem. And some of the examples I just mentioned are absolutely problems. Retreat is a problem when it is forced on people, or when retreat does nothing to improve the quality of their lives and nothing to help communities achieve the things that they value. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can be something that helps them. And I'm going to say some things that seem obvious, but that I feel need to be said. the world is changing. Climate change is one source of that change, but it is not the only source of that change. When we think about the world is very different today than it was 100 years ago. And that's a good thing. Some of those changes have been for the worse, but most of those have been to the benefit. And in the next another 100 years, the world will be different again, even if we stop climate change tomorrow. And so what we face when we think about climate adaptation is not how do we prevent change, it's about how do we choose what change we want to see. It's about how we choose what we're going to save and bring with us into the future, what we're going to purposefully move somewhere else, and what we're going to let go. Those are the choices we get to make. The choice we get to make is not to stay in stasis and stay exactly where we are. And frankly, that's a bad decision for a lot of people anyway. When we think about maintaining the status quo, we also have to think about who is that good for? And it's not good for everyone. So climate adaptation is not just a chance to deal with the risks and the hazards being promoted by climate change. It's also an opportunity to think more generally about how do we want to use the impetus and the drive of climate change to do something better, more holistically speaking. Right? How do we design cities that are not only flood-proof, but also equitable, with affordable housing, with good livelihoods, with nature-based access to green spaces? Right? It can't just be about preventing the harms. It has to be about leveraging the goods as well. And so when I think one of the reasons I'm excited about the prospects of moving and relocation is in some places this will be the right answer. It won't be everywhere. Some places have very strong ties to the land, and they culturally, historically, because of personal connections, whatever, they need to be exactly there. But for many people, they don't need to be on that particular parcel of land. They could be a mile away and still have this kind of life that they want to live, and maybe even in a better way. One of my favorite quotes about retreat is from US Marine Corps General Oliver Smith, and he led a very large retreat during the Korean War, and he says in a very Marine Corps way, he says, "Retreat, hell, we're just advancing in a different direction." And it's so wonderfully military, so hoorah. But it's also really important, and it gets at a really important question, which is that if we are retreating, we can't just be stepping back. We're actually moving in a new direction. So the question is, where are we moving? And so to anyone watching this when this airs, the question is, what do you want us to be achieving? Where are we heading? What do you want your community to look like in 100 years? By 2100, 80 years from now, 2100. Anyone with small children, your children will be alive in 2100. So what world do you want them to have in 2100? And that's the world we have to start building today. And that world probably means some big changes between now and there. And so when we think about that, 2100 is launching, the United Nations is launching the decade of ocean science. And they have this catchphrase of the science we need for the ocean we want, which is a wonderful phrase. What is the ocean we want? What is it? What's the coast we want? Right? Is it a coast full of cement walls that are 6 feet high, 18 feet high, 20 feet high in some places to defend against not just sea level rise, but the waves from storms that are coming? Is that the coast we want as a society, as communities? Is the coast we want homes that are elevated 20 feet above the road, where they're hard to access for people in wheelchairs or people with mobility issues, where you don't lose that front porch culture of people talking to each other? Is the future we want one with raised roads and floods into basement apartments? I mean, I'm saying these things because I don't think they're the future we want, but I think they're the future we're building. If we don't want a future with 20-foot cement walls, we have to stop building cement walls. If we don't want a future with houses raised 20 feet above the ground, we have to stop doing that. And if that is the future we want, then great. But let's think about why we want it. And what is it that we're preserving? And what is it that we're giving up in order to preserve it? In some places that will make sense. We'll say, no, staying here is so important that we are willing to give up access to the coast. We're willing to give up a healthy beach. We're willing to give up that community connection because it's so important to us. But we need to be really clear about the trade-offs that we're making. Anote, you mentioned hard decisions coming. And I think this is one of the reasons I find retreat so fascinating, is I think it forces us to face the hard choices. The fact that the world is changing and that we can't keep it the same and that we get to make choices. And if we're really mindful about those choices, I think there's hope that we can do something better and not just something that deals with the consequences that we are reaping right now. So yeah, with that, this will be one of my action items too, but for anyone watching this, I really just want to urge that. What is the future that you want that we're working forward? Actually, that's not true. I will add one more thing, which is that recently I've been working on a project with about 100 other international scholars. It's called the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative. We've reviewed over 1,500 academic papers on adaptation around the world, looking at the level of adaptation. And what we find is that adaptation tends to be small scale, slow, and really not very in depth. And this is my take on this, and I don't speak for all of my co-authors here, but the scale of adaptation that we see around the world does not in any way match the threat of what's coming. We're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, we're fiddling on the margins, and we're not dealing with the core issues. In the United States, we're looking at moving 1 or 2 houses here and there. We're not dealing with the fact that large cities are exposed. We're not talking about the scale of the issue that we need to be thinking about. And if we started thinking bigger picture, we might also start thinking more creatively. So rather than coming up with like, really is the most creative thing that we can come up with in the United States is to build a concrete wall around a big city? Why? Why is that our most creative, most bold, most ambitious strategy to deal with climate change? Why isn't it floating cities and gardens and skyscrapers full of gardens? Why isn't it something out of science fiction? Why are we not leveraging the creativity and the innovation that we have around the world to do something bold with climate adaptation? It's wonderful that we're taking small actions now, but we need something bigger. And when we think bigger and bolder, I think there's also room to be inspired as well as motivated out of concern for what's coming.
That's awesome, Siders. Serge, what's your vision for Imperial Beach? You grew up there, you were born there. Following on Siders' comments, where do you see the future of Imperial Beach?
Well, so those are great comments. And my issue is, small city. And, we've seen the destructive nature of the pandemic and how, again, the folks who are the least and impacted the most got the least amount of help. And I think that's the same thing with climate, the social equity issue, right? Whether you're in a atoll in the Pacific or a small blue collar city, it's like, how do you pay for this, right? And, everybody talks a good game at the international level about what they want to do. But when Anote talks about the fact that he wants to have his folks, they may have to leave, it's like, well, great. That's really interesting, but we don't have any money, right? And I think right now the big picture is coming with potentially the Green New Deal and very tied to let's do big things. And I know in California, we're talking about climate bonds and the idea that we're going to be doing a massive really investment in natural climate solutions and really focused on adaptation measures. And I think that has to be what we do. And we have to focus on the folks who have the least first, rather than the folks in Malibu who can do a geologic hazard bond, basically, or fund, and then self-pay for a lot of these adaptation measures. That's what's really playing out nationally. It's the wealthiest communities can afford to deal with this, and then the least, the least wealthy communities can't. So my vision is that we start doing the retreat for our public infrastructure, that we do everything we can to enhance our wetlands, that we make it very clear to our residents that the government is not going to bail them out for having their homes damaged. And we had a significant round of surf in January, some very big winter storms and consistent surf that caused some pretty significant erosion. And we had some revetment in front of people's homes fall down, and they said, oh, well, when is the city going to pay for it to fix it? And we're like, no, that's not our problem. We don't pay for that. But here's the link to the California Coastal Commission permit. And I think there's a lot of disconnect for people that really think that somehow the government's coming to the rescue, because the government has come to the rescue and bailed out Houston and cities around the country when these storms happen, without doing the kind of adaptation measures and then infrastructure measures they need to do to deal with the next storm. So, my whole thing is, who's going to pay for it? We need to make sure that the cities like mine have funding, and then we can address this, but it's going to take, some good planning and cities proactively getting funding now to deal with some of the public infrastructure. But the private stuff on private housing, that's a whole other issue that right now my city doesn't have the capacity to deal with. I wish we lived in a society where the checks were coming from the federal government, but until now, that hasn't happened. And so we're in a tough place. But I think when the pandemic was going to happen, California was looking at floating a climate bond. I think that may be delayed a little bit, but I was hopeful that there may be some hope coming for our city. And then finally, my vision is that the people who caused this, the fossil fuel companies, they pay up. They pay my city and other cities around the world for the causes the damages they've caused. And I think these court cases may make that happen.
I think that's a fantastic, Serge, in that the equity piece is so important, and it's something that we often hear at a very theoretical level, and it's hard to make that concrete. And I think it's that having that as a priority, knowing that what you want for communities, we want to make it more equitable, we want to help the people with the least, it can make really different decisions. There's a huge controversy going on in Texas right now, in Houston, because one bond measure passed for flood management, and wealthy neighborhoods that had historically gotten more of the funding thought they were going to continue to get the funding. But the town council had recently decided that they were going to make equity a priority. And so instead, the money is now going to go to a historically Black neighborhood who has not gotten disinvestment, or has not gotten investment, right? Has been ignored for decades. And so, as you can imagine, there's a huge controversy here. But I think it's really important that when that becomes a goal, not just we're going to prevent risk, but we are actively going to try to address equity and help address some of these wrongs, it can really change where the money goes and how decisions are made. And I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not just lip service if we do something concrete about it. So I think that's a really great vision to have at the core.
Yeah, the only thing to remind you is that, and I know, we all know this, that beachfront property owners in the United States, at least in Southern California, are some of the wealthiest, most powerful people with an army of lobbyists and lawyers, and so they can spend a lot of time fighting to make sure that their voices are prioritized, right? And I think what's been great about the California Coast Commission is they've acknowledged, and I think there's a movement in California to say, the rest of the state actually owns the beach too. So we need to make decisions for those folks who don't live on the beach, but love the beach and need to have access to the beach. And I think that's the missing element that I forgot, is we prioritizing public access, Mark. And I think that's really critical to make sure that everything we're doing is about making sure that the 99% of our folks in our city who don't live on the beach can have access to the beach regardless of what we do, that resource is paramount. And I think we've seen during this pandemic that family, friendships, and nature, really, and economic well-being matter, and health, the essentials, what we emerge from as humans, right? Love, peace, matter more than ever. And that's access to the beach is critical, and that it plays a fundamental role in our society.
If I make a very short comment on this issue of climate justice, it's an issue that we have been pursuing for quite a long time at the international negotiations level, trying to find some way of assigning responsibility and liability where it properly belongs. And it's not been easy to do that. And even in Paris in 2015, we almost got there, but not quite. And it doesn't seem likely that the countries like ours who are going to suffer the most will be able to get any kind of support in dealing with the impacts of climate change. As I said, from my own experience, I've been attending conference after conference, and this is a question that's never really been answered. And I know the Green Climate Fund has been set up, but it doesn't answer the question. And so I've been in arguments with other leaders who argue that before as we were moving to the Paris discussions in 2015, that they could not afford, because we, the small island countries in the Pacific, were going for 1.5 rise in global temperature, rather than 2 degrees. And our neighboring countries, who are developed countries, said, no, we can't afford to go less than 2 degrees, because it would be too damaging for our economies. And I was there listening to all of this. I said, come on, I don't believe this. And I said, yes, I'm hearing what you're saying, but you've got to understand where I'm coming from. It's about the survival of our people. It's not about the welfare. And so these economic costs, which were so much debated and argued on the climate issue, they've never come up as we try to confront the pandemic. Look at the economic damage that's been done to all economies. All of the things that we were scared we were unable to do, it happened of its own accord with the COVID-19. And so they were doable. We're not committed to doing it. And my take is simply because there are those who believe they benefit by what is happening on climate change. And there's a lot of resistance to putting into place the remedies because they see this as a threat to what it is that they possess, the power, the wealth, and whatever it is. And so we need to go back to our sense of values. We need, whether we can do that. But I think what is coming to be realized, because when I was talking about climate change, I said, climate change is an existential threat for countries like mine. No other country was saying this, but now almost every country is saying it. And they're saying it is civilization as we know it is on the verge of extinction. But I think it was always obvious, because what happens to those on the front line, as they fall, others will come on the front line, and it will continue to happen. But I think it's a bit late to be doing this now, but we need to work very fast. But I think it's I was a politician. I blame our political leaders because they continue to prioritize their national political agendas ahead of the survival of humanity, the survival of our planet. And I think that's been the problem, very short term. And I always say in jest, but I think in reality, in many ways, that our politicians think about the next election, never about the next generation.
Let's move then to what can we do? So you have an opportunity here to speak to our friends at this conference. What is it that you would recommend that people can do if they're passionate or want to make a difference on this issue? Serge, you want to start?
Get involved politically. Not just vote, but vote, attend your local planning meetings, see what they're planning. Are they planning to build the new affordable housing inside the floodplain? Are they planning, to build glass-walled subway stations in a heat-prone area? What are they planning to do? Get involved. It's the best way to engage with your community and think about what you want for your community in the future and to have your voice heard. You need to find a way to make your voice heard, because I think that's the only way we will push our political leaders to do better, is to make voices heard, right? In every election, in every issue that we possibly can to push that agenda. We have to do that. And to a domestic audience, to the United States at least, I would say read climate fiction. And I say that because some of the great climate fiction that's coming out right now really pushes what the future could look like, for better and for worse. And as people, we often have a really hard time thinking beyond, as you say, the next election, to the next generation. And climate fiction can really help us to think about what the world could look like, what we could be leaving to the next generation. And again, for better or for worse. And so if you are having trouble answering the question of what you want your community to look like in 100 years, climate fiction is a great place to start, where you can see what other people think the world could look like in 100 years and to say, I want that or I don't want that. So that's a suggestion.
So, in terms of what we can do, there's some specific things that we can do to ask for the Biden administration if you're in the United States, and that's to really support what I would imagine an infrastructure bill wrapped in the Green New Deal, which specifically will have, I would hope, funding for climate adaptation, natural climate solutions. And what does that mean? Simply helping to do the kinds of things that we can do naturally in wetlands, for example, and doing things like dune restoration projects, all the sort of low-hanging fruit. Those are really important things. If we had a national project to do that, that would make a big difference for a lot of communities like mine that don't have access to those resources. Second, I think the Biden administration and conservationists around the world have proposed this 30 by 30, that we would, by 2030, protect 30% of our rivers, lakes, wetlands, our open spaces. That's critical. The low-hanging fruit is to do everything we can to preserve all of our blue and green spaces that help us adapt to climate change. These devastating climate crises that result in wildfires or big storms that envelop islands. So those are two specific things that I think that will tangibly make a big difference to help address the climate crisis in the United States.
If I can add to that, I think it's. I guess our situation is a little different from your side of the world, and I think we stand to lose everything. And the question is, where do we go from here? And I'm afraid that's a question that's never really been addressed or answered. I've come across a number of propositions like, why don't we have something like what the United States has, with some of the Micronesian countries, a compact type agreement, and which is similar to what New Zealand has with some of the South Pacific Island countries. It has a very free association. But the reality, the brutal reality that we may not have a homeland in the future is something that we really have to come to terms with. I've been called a number of things for saying the things that I do, but I'm afraid that I think these are the realities that we have to come to terms with. And it's better to be prepared rather than to bury our heads in the sand and hope it will not happen when we see all the signs. The science is very, very clear. And until we can mobilize the resources to build the kind of radical adaptation that we need to do, I don't know, some of you may know, I'm on record as having looked at the possibility of floating islands. Okay, they're crazy ideas, but we're not left with a lot of options. And if we want to maintain our continued existence as a nation, we have to do something like this. We have every reason to do that because we have a huge exclusive economic zone, which is huge in marine resources, both living and mineral resources. So we have the resources to build that. We just have not been able to exploit the resources in order to mobilize them to build that resilience. And so these are the challenges. The final question, Mark, that I want to address is, what do we say to people who are worried about what's happening with sea level rise? And I think my only answer, which I've really said a number of times, is, don't ever believe that climate change will not touch you, because it will touch you in different ways. And it's not just about sea level rise. I used to think so. But our most immediate challenge, as I see it, is the change in the weather pattern, because once we get a storm, a Category 1 cyclone coming our way, there will be nothing left of the islands. And so we need to tell those who do not believe that they are threatened, that climate change is not relevant to their life.
I'll just add, from the viewpoint of a scientist working on this problem, buried in all those kind of dry curves was a bit of hope, in the sense that we're facing a challenge on two different fronts here. One of them is we have to lower emissions. We cannot get the curve down. If we cannot bend the curve, there is no adaptation solution. We are facing the choices that Anote is talking about. We have to keep the curve down. So that is job one. The second one is that even with the best adaptation, or even with the best mitigation measures, adaptation is a necessity. And that has to be done in an equitable way, as we've heard over and over again today. And building those adaptation strategies, I think, actually, if we do it right, will lead to a better society. So I have some hope here that people will act fast enough and with purpose and with conviction that we can bend the curve and avoid the worst of these possible scenarios we've been talking about. So in closing, we just want to encourage you to share the information you learned today with your networks, to continue raising awareness for the reality of sea level rise and the real human impacts we are facing. Thank you.